On May 18, 1959, two U.S. Army officers stood on an endless white horizon in northwestern Greenland, their aviator sunglasses reflecting ice and snow in every direction. But Colonel John Keckering and Captain Thomas Evans weren't there to admire the scenery. They were planning something that would remain hidden from the world for nearly 4 decades. Within months, hundreds of engineers would arrive at this desolate location to begin construction on what would become known as Camp Century, a facility under the ice that would be celebrated as a triumph of American scientific research. But what the American public did not know, what was hidden from the Danish government, and what would shock the world when it was finally revealed in 1997 was that Camp Century was never really about science at all. The timing wasn't coincidental. 2 years earlier, on October 4th, 1957, the Soviet Union had launched Sputnik into orbit, sending shockwaves through American military and political circles. The message was clear. Soviets had rockets capable of reaching space, which meant they had rockets capable of reaching anywhere on Earth. By 1959, the geopolitical chess game between the United States and the USSR had entered a new and terrifying phase. One where nuclear annihilation was no longer a distant possibility, but an everyday reality that military strategists had to plan around. The Arctic had suddenly become the most valuable piece of real estate on the planet, the shortest route between North America and the Soviet Union. Any missile launched from the Soviet territory towards American cities would cross over the top of the world, and any American response would follow the same path in reverse. Greenland, technically a territory of Denmark, but geographically positioned like a massive frozen aircraft carrier between continents, had already become home to Thule Air Base following a 1951 defense agreement. The base was part of the Distant Early Warning Line, a chain of radar stations designed to detect incoming Soviet bombers. But what the US Army had in mind was something far more audacious, something that would push the boundaries of engineering, secrecy, and international diplomacy. The concept was simple in theory, but staggering in execution. Build an entire missile base underneath the Greenland ice sheet, a network of tunnels that could house 600 nuclear missiles capable of surviving a Soviet first strike and retaliating with devastating precision. The ice itself would be both camouflage and armor, hiding the missiles from Soviet reconnaissance while protecting them from attack. Mobile rail systems would constantly move the missiles to new positions, making it impossible for the enemy to target them. The entire operation would cover 52,000 square miles, roughly 3 times the size of Denmark itself, with an estimated 2,500 miles of tunnels snaking beneath the frozen surface. But there was a problem. Actually, several problems stacked on top of each other. Nobody actually knew if you could build something like this under the moving ice. The Greenland ice sheet isn't a static block of frozen water. It's a living, moving glacier that flows constantly under its own enormous weight. Nobody knew if people could live and work in such conditions for extended periods, or if the psychological toll of living in an underground ice fortress would make the whole operation impractical. And perhaps most critically, nobody wanted to tell the Danish government what they were really planning to do on Danish territory. Denmark was a NATO ally, but it was also a small country with a strong tradition of neutrality and a deep aversion to nuclear weapons on its soil. So, the US Army came up with a cover story that was technically true, but fundamentally misleading. They would build a smaller facility first, a prototype that would be publicly promoted as a scientific research station studying Arctic conditions and testing new construction techniques. They would invite journalists, they would publish papers, they would make it all look completely above board. Scientists would conduct legitimate research on ice cores, climate patterns, and survival techniques. And while those scientists conducted their work, US Army engineers would be gathering the data they really needed, whether Project Iceworm, the secret mission to build an underground nuclear fortress, was actually possible. It was the kind of dual-purpose deception that the Cold War made routine, where science and military necessity existed in the same space, but only one was allowed to be visible to the public. The site selected for Camp Century was brutal even by Arctic standards. Situated at an elevation of 6,600 feet on the Greenland ice sheet, the location experienced temperatures that could plummet to 70 degrees below zero. Wind speeds regularly exceeded 125 miles per hour, creating whiteout conditions that could last for days. Annual snowfall totaled more than 4 feet, constantly threatening to bury any surface structure. The first challenge was simply getting materials to the site. U.S. Army engineers built a road across the ice from Thule Air Base, a distance of 150 miles. They used massive bobsled called heavy swings to transport 6,000 tons of equipment and supplies, and these sleds had a maximum speed of 2 miles per hour. That meant the journey from Thule to Camp Century took 70 hours in good weather, and good weather in northwestern Greenland was a relative concept. Convoys crawled across the ice sheet, each one loaded with everything from wooden building materials to steel arch supports to components of a nuclear reactor, all while exposed to conditions that could kill an unprotected person in minutes. Drivers worked in shifts, bundled in layers of Arctic gear, navigating by compass and dead reckoning across a landscape where everything looked identical in every direction. Once materials arrived, engineers faced the next challenge. How do you actually build underground in ice? The technique they developed was ingenious in its simplicity. Using Swiss-made machines called Peter plows, they would dig deep trenches into the compacted snow and ice, some more than 1,000 feet long. These trenches were then covered with curved steel arches and topped with several feet of snow for insulation. Inside the trenches, crews assembled prefabricated wooden buildings, making sure to leave airspace on all sides to minimize melting from the heat inside. The longest trench became Main Street, a subterranean avenue that would eventually house everything from sleeping quarters to a library, from laboratories to a barbershop. They even drilled down through the ice to create a well that provided 10,000 gallons of fresh water daily, a remarkable feat that solved one of the biggest logistical challenges of Arctic habitation. By October 1960, just 16 months after construction began, Camp Century was operational. The facility consisted of 21 interconnected tunnels spanning 9,800 feet, all of it carved into and covered by ice. It could house up to 200 people at a time, providing them with warm showers, hot meals, recreational facilities, and even a small theater for movie nights. The crown jewel was the PM-2A nuclear reactor, one of the first portable nuclear power plants ever built, generating 2 megawatts of electrical power and providing heat to the entire complex. The Army had done it. They had built a functioning city under the ice for about $8 million, a bargain by military standards. Now came the really hard part, keeping the secret while figuring out if Project Iceworm could actually work. The public relations campaign for Camp Century was extensive and carefully orchestrated. The Saturday Evening Post ran a major feature in 1960, complete with glossy photographs and breathless descriptions of American ingenuity conquering the Arctic. Television crews filmed soldiers playing ping pong, scientists examining ice cores, and engineers confidently discussing construction techniques. National Geographic sent journalists who wrote admiringly about the achievement. What none of these journalists knew, however, was that everything they were seeing was essentially a proof of concept for something far larger and far more militarily significant. Army planners were analyzing every aspect of facilities' performance, gathering data on ice movement, structural integrity, power generation, and logistics. The scientific research being conducted was real and valuable, particularly the ice core drilling that would provide climatologists with detailed records of ancient climate patterns, but it was also the perfect cover. In Denmark, the reaction was considerably more complicated. On August 18, 1959, at a cocktail party in Copenhagen, U.S. Ambassador Val Peterson informed Danish Foreign Minister Jens Otto Krag that plans for the American base in Greenland had moved on beyond the embassy's control, a diplomatic way of saying construction was already underway, whether Denmark liked it or not. Denmark had signed the 1951 Defense of Greenland Agreement, which allowed the U.S. military facilities in Greenland to be built. But Denmark also had a strict policy against nuclear weapons on Danish territory. The Danish government's solution was to downplay the military aspects of Camp Century and emphasize its scientific mission. When Prime Minister H.C. Hansen briefed his government's Committee on Foreign Affairs in September 1959, he assured them that the project posed no political problems. This was, at best, an incomplete picture. What Hansen didn't tell most of his government was that he had privately agreed to allow the United States to store nuclear weapons at Thule Air Base, a decision that would have caused massive political upheaval if it had become public. The presence of Camp Century and its nuclear reactor was just one more secret in a growing web of nuclear secrets that Danish officials were keeping from their own people. It was a house of cards that would eventually collapse onto itself. While Camp Century was being celebrated in American media and carefully managed in Danish circles, the real work of Project Iceworm was happening behind closed doors at Army planning facilities. The classified 1960 Army report titled Strategic Value of the Greenland Ice Cap laid out the full scope of what the military had in mind, and it was breathtaking in its ambition. Using Camp Century as a model, Project Iceworm called for a construction of 52,000 square miles of tunnels beneath the Greenland ice sheet, potentially expanding to 100,000 square miles. The entire tunnel network will be larger than the state of Alabama, all of it hidden under hundreds of feet of ice. The plan called for deploying 600 Iceman missiles throughout the vast underground network, with launch sites positioned every 4 miles along the tunnels. These weren't just any missiles. They were specially modified versions of the Minuteman intercontinental ballistic missile, redesigned to operate in extreme cold and equipped to punch through the ice sheet overhead when launched. Each Iceman missile would have a range of 3,300 miles, enough to reach virtually any target in the Soviet Union from Greenland. The missiles would be mounted on mobile rail systems, constantly moving through the tunnels to new positions, making it essentially impossible for Soviet forces to target them. Supporting this deployment would require 60 launch control centers scattered throughout the tunnel network, each capable of independently commanding multiple missiles. The entire operation would need approximately 11,000 soldiers living full-time under the ice, a population equivalent to a small city. The logistical challenges were staggering. How do you feed 11,000 people in the Arctic? How do you maintain morale when your entire world is ice tunnels and ventilation systems? The strategic value was undeniable from a military perspective. If the Soviet Union launched a first strike against the United States, the missiles would survive. Protected by thousands of feet of ice and constantly moving, they would be nearly impossible to attack. The Army estimated that the Iceworm arsenal alone could destroy roughly 80% of high-value targets in the Soviet Union and Eastern Europe. On paper, Project Iceworm was exactly the kind of game-changing strategic advantage that Cold War military planners dreamed about. But the Arctic was about to prove them very differently. The problem started appearing almost immediately. First and most fundamental issue was the ice itself. Despite its appearance of being solid and permanent, the Greenland ice sheet is actually in constant motion, flowing outward from the center like an incredibly slow-moving glacier. Snow and ice behave as viscoelastic materials over time, which means they deform and flow under their own weight. The engineers had known this in theory, but the actual rate of deformation at Camp Century was far worse than their models had predicted. The walls of the tunnels were constantly narrowing, bulging inwards as ice compressed. The ceilings were dropping, requiring constant maintenance to prevent collapse. By mid-1962, just 2 years after Camp Century had become fully operational, the ceiling of the reactor room had dropped so much that the engineers had to jack it up 5 feet using hydraulic supports. 5 feet in 2 years. The implications were devastating for Project Iceworm's grand plans. If the prototype facility was already experiencing structural problems after only 2 years, what would happen to a tunnel network spanning 52,000 square miles that was supposed to operate for decades? The Army's own geologists taking ice core samples found that the ice was moving much faster than anticipated. Within 3 years of excavation, the data demonstrated that glacier movement would destroy the tunnels and any launch stations within them in approximately 2 years. And the technical challenges extended beyond ice movement. The Iceman missile itself was proving more difficult to develop than anticipated. Taking a Minuteman ICBM and modifying it to operate in temperatures of 70 below zero while buried under the ice and mounted on mobile rails was not a simple engineering problem. The extreme cold affected everything from the missile's fuel and guidance systems to its electronic components. How do you keep a nuclear missile ready for instant launch when surrounded by ice? How do you ensure the launch mechanism can punch through potentially hundreds of feet of ice overhead? Then there was the issue of getting Danish permission, which the army had been conveniently avoiding. When Ambassador Peterson approached Prime Minister Hansen to discuss Iceworm, Hansen's response was deliberately ambiguous. He said that since Peterson hadn't submitted any concrete plans or asked direct questions about deploying nuclear missiles, he didn't need to comment. The army interpreted this non-answer as a green light to proceed with planning. It was remarkable diplomatic wishful thinking, assuming silence meant consent, when it really meant, please don't make me give you an answer that will create a political crisis. By 1963, the writing was on the wall. The accumulating evidence from Camp Century made it clear that Project Iceworm, as conceived, was not going to work. The unstable ice conditions couldn't support a massive permanent installation. The Joint Chiefs of Staff, weighing the mounting technical difficulties against the enormous expense and the increasingly shaky diplomatic situation with Denmark, made the decision to officially cancel Project Iceworm in 1963, just 4 years after construction on Camp Century had begun. But the cancellation of Iceworm didn't immediately mean the end of Camp Century itself. The facility continued to operate on a limited basis. Its role fundamentally changed. Without the missile deployment mission, Camp Century became what it had always pretended to be, a research station. Scientists there continued collecting ice cores that would prove invaluable to climatologists for decades. In late July 1963, during a planned reactor shutdown for maintenance, the Army decided to operate Camp Century as a summer-only facility. The PM-2A nuclear reactor was never reactivated, and in 1964, the portable reactor was removed entirely. The facility limped along for 2 more years on diesel generators. The population dwindled from 200 soldiers and scientists to a skeleton crew that arrived each summer. The tunnels continued to deform, requiring constant work just to keep the facility accessible. The facility was evacuated in 1965, and in 1966, the U.S. Army made it official. Camp Century would be permanently abandoned. The remaining equipment worth recovering was removed, but the vast majority of infrastructure was left in place. This included wooden buildings, steel supports, thousands of feet of electrical wiring, vehicles, machinery, and most concerning from a long-term perspective, substantial amounts of waste. The waste inventory was staggering. There were approximately 200,000 liters of diesel fuel still in storage tanks. There were 24 million liters of wastewater, including sewage, stored in tanks since the facility had no way to treat it or to dispose of it. There were building materials containing toxic substances like polychlorinated biphenyls or PCBs, commonly used in construction at the time, but now known to be serious environmental hazards. And there was radioactive coolant from the nuclear reactor, not a massive amount in terms of radioactivity, but enough to be a concern if it ever leaked. The Army's assumption, shared by the Danish government, was that all of this waste would be buried forever under perpetually accumulating snow and ice. Every year, the Greenland ice sheet receives about 4 feet of new snowfall, which compacts into ice over time. The calculation was simple. The waste would be buried deeper and deeper, crushed eventually into nothing over time. It seemed reasonable in 1966 when the term global warming hadn't even been coined yet. For nearly 3 decades, Camp Century and Project Iceworm remained one of the Cold War's best-kept secrets. The American public had no idea that this scientific research station was actually a prototype for a massive underground nuclear missile base. The Danish public had no idea their government had allowed such a facility on Danish territory. Even most Danish government officials had been kept in the dark, aware only of vague outlines that Prime Minister Hansen and his inner circle had chosen to share. The secret was so well maintained that when the Cold War ended in 1991, most historians assumed that any classified projects would prove relatively mundane. Then, in January 1995, everything changed. The Danish parliament ordered an investigation by the Danish Foreign Policy Institute, known by its acronym DUPI. The investigation was prompted by new information about the 1968 Thule Air Base B-52 crash, when an American bomber carrying nuclear weapons had crashed near the base, spreading radioactive contamination. The Danish government's previous statements about that incident had been contradicted by declassified documents, creating a political crisis and raising questions about what else had been hidden regarding American nuclear activities in Greenland. As DUPI researchers dug through the newly declassified American documents obtained throughout 1996 and interviewed retired officials who were finally willing to talk, they uncovered something shocking. The full story of Project Iceworm emerged in stages, with each revelation more remarkable than the last. The Scientific Research Station had been, from the beginning, a cover story for one of the most ambitious military projects of the Cold War. When the DUPI report was published on January 17, 1997, the political fallout in Denmark and Greenland was immediate and severe. Danish officials were furious at their American counterparts for having deceived them, or at minimum for having been deliberately vague to the point of effective deception. But the deeper anger was directed at their own government, particularly at Prime Minister Hansen's administration. It became clear that Hansen and his closest advisors had known, or at least strongly suspected, what Camp Century was really about. His carefully ambiguous responses to American diplomatic inquiries, his assurances to Parliament that there were no problems, his emphasis on scientific research while downplaying military dimensions, all of it looked very different in hindsight. The revelation was particularly painful in Greenland, where a growing independence movement was already questioning the relationship with Denmark and the presence of American military installations. Greenlanders felt that major military projects affecting their territory should not have been approved through vague diplomatic exchanges between Washington and Copenhagen with minimal Greenlandic input. The fact that the project had involved nuclear weapons made it even worse. But the biggest shock was still to come, and it wouldn't emerge from classified documents. It would come from climate scientists studying how global warming was affecting the Greenland ice sheet. In 2016, a team of researchers led by climate scientist William Colgan published a study that fundamentally changed how people thought about Camp Century. Using climate models and detailed analysis of ice accumulation and melting patterns, the team made a startling prediction. The section of Greenland ice sheet covering Camp Century would likely transition from net snowfall to net melting by the year 2090. Once that transition occurred, it would only be a matter of time before the facility and all of the waste left behind in 1966 would be exposed to the surface. Colgan's team had mapped out the extent of the waste, and the numbers were sobering. The contaminated area covered approximately 55 hectares, roughly the size of 100 football fields. All of that diesel fuel, sewage, PCBs, and radioactive coolant that the Army had assumed would be safely entombed forever was now on track to be released into the Arctic environment. The environmental implications were serious, but difficult to quantify precisely. The meltwater would likely carry diluted contaminants towards the coast, potentially affecting ecosystems along a 250-kilometer path. Arctic ecosystems are particularly sensitive to pollution, and substances like PCBs can accumulate in the food chain. The bigger question was one that immediately sparked international debate, was far more contentious. Who was responsible for cleaning this up? The United States had built Camp Century and left the waste behind. Denmark had given permission for the facility and agreed to its abandonment. The waste was located in Greenland, which was now a self-governing territory within the Kingdom of Denmark. So, was this an American problem, Denmark's problem, or Greenland's problem? The 2016 study triggered a crisis in the Danish-Greenlandic relations that dwarfed even the initial Iceworm revelations. Greenland's Minister of Foreign Affairs, Vitus Qujaukitsoq, was furious with Denmark for not having done more to address the issue earlier. From the Greenlandic perspective, Denmark had allowed a foreign power to build a potentially hazardous facility in Greenland and then had done nothing for decades while that facility slowly turned into an environmental time bomb. The Danish government initially tried to downplay the issue, pointing to other climate models suggesting the waste might actually be buried deeper if snowfall increased. They argued that even if melting did occur, it would be gradual and contamination would be so diluted as to be effectively harmless. But the political pressure was too intense, and in 2018, Denmark announced it would establish a Camp Century climate monitoring program led by the Geological Survey of Denmark and Greenland. This monitoring program would track conditions at the site, providing better data on whether the waste was buried deeper or if it had been moving closer to the surface. It was a start, but it left the fundamental question of legal and financial responsibility unresolved. As of today, the US government has not taken a formal position on whether it bears responsibility for cleanup costs that it might eventually run into hundreds of millions of dollars. But the story of Project Iceworm and Camp Century continues to evolve even to this day. In April 2024, NASA scientists using advanced radar technology flew over the northwestern Greenland and got a remarkably clear image of Camp Century, buried more than 100 feet below the surface. The radar could distinguish individual structures within the old facility, showing Main Street and the network of tunnels still intact despite decades of ice pressure. The image was a stark reminder that Camp Century hasn't gone away. It's just sleeping under the ice, waiting for the day when climate change wakes it up again. And when that day comes, decades of Cold War waste will re-enter the environment, a final legacy of a project that was supposed to stay secret forever and stay buried forever, but which has now become a symbol of how the decisions we make in pursuit of security can create unforeseen consequences that outlast the threats they were meant to address.